if we talk about weapons and equipments, what has changed since the summer fightings? What kind of equipment the rebels or the pro-Russian forces or the Russian forces, but we're talking about pro-Russian forces mainly, what kind of weapons and equipment do they have now which they didn't have before?
For our information, what we have, for our source of information, what we have, they are trying to have MLRS, it's called BM-21 Grad. Additional one, it's called Smerch. They also are trying to have another automatic artillery system, SAU Pion and other one, which we're also keeping in our inventory. But also what we are, it is Panzer, another system, MLRS system, which are more powerful than we could expect. It's firing or shelling on the distance up to the 90 kilometers, not 15 or 20 like Grad. It is additional advantage for them. But also for our expectation, they are giving more with humanitarian convoys, more shells, more routes for doing action in eastern part of Ukraine.
So we can say that the conflict this time, in winter time, differs so much from the summer
exactly.
time.
For example,
fightings.
from summer time, we evaluated presence of Russian troops after 23rd, 21st of August, roughly 2,500 and 3,000. Right now we have roughly 9,000. It is exactly increased 6,000 people.
But, I mean, how are you able to tell? Is that something you can share? I mean, is it satellite information? Is it something else? Is it
including satellite information? We have images, picture from Lugansk, from Donetsk. We are getting information from our partners, from NATO, EU channel, because we established good channel for security exchange information on a regular basis. It is partly objective information, and we believe it is true. Plus, some military equipments, hardware equipments, artillery, heavy equipments right now are stolen in some of the storages of Donetsk and Lugansk region.
I mean, I ask because...
And cover it, hide it from, let's say, simple Ukrainians who can see that.
I mean, I ask because, you know, traditionally, if we're talking about World War II or traditional warfare, you have a large number of soldiers, large number of tanks and other vehicles that are easier to identify from the air. They're in an open area. They're not trying to hide it. The fighting we've had in the East, much of it has been less traditional. It's been smaller groups. It's moved quickly. And I mean, that's why I was curious, you know, how it can be identified. But from another angle, what have we changed? I mean, in terms of the Ukrainians, are they better equipped now? Have they received more systems? We've heard about, I believe, these radar systems that they've gotten from Western partners to try and identify artillery. Could you say anything about that?
For the last couple months, we are working very closely with our foreign friends who are trying to support us with lethal and non-lethal equipment. Lethal, it is still not on the agenda, but we are working with specific country. But what I mean, not lethal, for example, it is a radio location station counter battery, which we have gotten from US. It's very much effective tools in order to identify the artillery system and be more active and be more to work in advance, not to wait until you will receive shelling, but to stop it in let's say preliminary stage. Also, we have received some equipment which related to rations. It is individual dry rations. We also received some ammunitions like military BDU, shoes. Also, we received some tactical communication means which are very helpful. It is part of communication line chain of command, and we are, with this kind of Western equipment, keeping our line of communication close to separatist terrorists, what it was not on the beginning of the conflict, because we used to the same equipment or say type of equipment. And also we are receiving moral and political support via the NATO and EU channels.
But has there been any lethal aid so far, or is that just discussion?
No, it is only discussion, only negotiation, but I hope that Western politicians, Western military are thinking that we are, based on our inquiries, what we have on the list, it is enough to stop, not to make full scale or broad scale, exactly. And also they believe it, and I completely support our supreme commander that this operation could be resolved not only military means. Military means should support the political, diplomatic resolution of this situation in eastern part of Ukraine. Exactly on the scale or decision with Western politician that it is probably not time to give lethal equipment or lethal weapons, what we're expecting. For example, if we would receive high precision guided ammunitions, for sure it would be easy to make some defensive operation as well as to do in advance and not to give build a big escalation of the situation.
Well, and this is something that Poroshenko said many times, that it can only be resolved through diplomatic means. At the same time, though, we see more and more Ukrainians being affected by this war in the east, and we've had another wave of mobilization, which I believe is the fourth so far. Are you able to say anything about the conditions for the soldiers, how they're living, and maybe how that's changed since the summer as well?
Situation is improving for my assessment is tremendously. From time to time, I mean from summertime until winter time, we improve the living condition. In some areas are still difficult, but anyway, mood and readiness of Ukrainian soldiers are showing to fight without kind of utilities what we could have compared with Western
Sorry, difficult
partners.
in terms of living conditions?
Living conditions, yes.
Like what? Could you specify a bit more?
For example, we are looking for in the future Ukrainian armed forces, even right now, some mobile modules of living, of washing and other stuff. Some examples are, but it's not covered entire troops what we deployed in this area. It should be improved, and our operational support command as well as rear and armaments directorates are working on it, how to improve it. And also for the last 2.5 months we have received from our military industrial complex modernized and new piece of equipment. It is related to the tanks of Bulat, tank T-72. It is related to Jaguar, not Jaguar, some light infantry vehicle, some of them are been given our authority to OSCE mission in order to support their objectives. And also it is aircrafts, it is Mi-8, Mi-24 helicopters, also it is BTR-3E, BTR-4E, what are right now BTR-80. We receive it on to the troops, exactly. Much better right now.
I think that's all the time we have now. Thank you so much for joining us. Now I want you to have a look at a video from Svitlodarsk. This is a point near the front, specifically from a hospital, which serves as the first line for many Ukrainian soldiers, as well as locals caught in fire.
Сегодня привезли много раненых, в основном военные. 15 человек было вчера, да, все они были эвакуированы в город Артемовск, ЦРБ. Да, и сегодня 14 у нас было военных и 5 человек мирных с ранениями средней степени тяжести и тяжелые. В основном это Чернухино, город Дебальцево и Никишино. Это минно-взрывные травмы с травматической ампутацией конечностей, тупые травмы живота, оскольчатые ранения с повреждением внутренних органов. Сегодня привезли девочку, молодую, 92-го года рождения, значит, как со слов под завалами находилась, 17 лет, да, находилась под завалами, это уже поселок Мироновский. Да, она очень тяжелая, значит, там сочетанная травма с повреждением головного мозга. И благодаря, конечно, военным она была доставлена в травматологическое отделение города Артемовска. Потому что у нас нейрохирурга нет, мы справляемся только своими силами.
То есть вы оказываете, по сути, первую помощь?
Самую первую квалифицированную помощь. Если уже будет что-то неотложно, оперируем мы здесь. Те, которых можно транспортировать, мы их всех направляем в Артемовск, но потом дальше в Харьков, Краматорск и другие ближайшие больницы. В больнице очень не хватает оборудования, аппаратуры, дыхательных аппаратов, значит, аппаратов ЭКГ, дефибриллятора.
У вас нет дефибриллятора?
Он у нас есть очень старый и не работающий. Последние 5 дней, конечно же, здесь вот интенсивность обстрелов, вот эти канонады мы слышим каждый день постоянно и очень вблизи. То есть раньше вот еще с лета мы слышали как-то здесь далеко от стороны Дебальцево, а сейчас все как-то ближе к нам. Мы очень сильно, конечно, боимся, но находимся постоянно здесь. Вот мой персонал, они живут здесь в больнице, потому что подвальное помещение в случае чего тут более безопасно.
All right, now we're being joined by journalist David Patrikarakos, who works for the New York Times, Foreign Policy, and Politico, among others. Wonderful to have you here in the studio.
It's good to be here.
So, as I understand it, you recently returned from being embedded with Ukrainian forces in eastern Ukraine. Is that correct?
I wasn't embedded with them. What I did is I traveled with the civilian volunteers who are bringing supplies to the army. So obviously I went and traveled to all the various army camps, interviewed soldiers, spent time with soldiers. And I have previously stayed over in their camps and things like that.
And what was the mood this time in the East?
I mean, obviously things are getting very fraught, but what struck me was that there are a lot of experienced soldiers out there, and the morale amongst them seemed to be quite good. What you had actually, which I thought was very pleasing, was a lot of soldiers with long military experience who'd left the army and now joined up to fight and, you know, protect their homeland, as they called it. So the mood, given the situation, really wasn't too bad at all.
When we have a couple of tweets from you, we just wanted to share them with our viewers since it's great just insight to the situation there. The first one, if we can pull that up, we have the text, "We get no government help. Ministry of Health should pay for doctors. Ministry of Defense should pay for supplies, but they don't." And this was from a local hospital you visited. What was it like there? I mean, was there a sense that people were left on their own, or what was their kind of sentiment?
Well, obviously they're under huge amounts of pressure. As was explained to me, the casualties come in waves. After the next airport, obviously, there was a great wave of casualties. And these hospitals are essentially staging posts where critical cases are brought in, are patched up and stabilized before they're shipped off to larger hospitals in Kramatorsk, Dnipropetrovsk, places like that. So I would repeatedly ask, did they have enough supplies? And the answer was that a lot falls on the volunteers' shoulders. People like Anna Sandalova, the lady I traveled with from Support the Army of Ukraine, volunteers like her are providing quite a lot of the medical supplies now.
David, what do you think has changed in principles? If I'm not mistaken, the last time you were there, it was in summer.
No, it was in December. The last time I was in Donetsk was in the summer.
Okay.
The last time I was with the army, it was in December.
But in winter?
Yes. Yeah.
What do you think has changed in principle?
Okay, well, it was a bit warmer this
over-
time, which I'm glad about. It was minus 25 last time. I think, look, what is happening is obviously the Ukrainian front is being pushed back slightly. There is obviously the prospect of Debaltseve being totally encircled and cut off. I think the casualties are mounting. The sound of artillery now is more or less constant. The fighting is really, really intensifying, I think. But the Ukrainians seem to be fighting very hard, you know. There's a lot of movement around there. A lot of vehicles are being constantly, when you go into the army camps, again and again, you see vehicles being repaired, people running to and from vehicles, you know, cleaning tanks. I was very fortunate to be shown big storehouses full of Ukrainian armor. And, you know, generally it's very active. And, you know, the activity is relentless. You know, the people are fighting, the soldiers are fighting very, very hard. And I think the change from December is that it's just a lot more intense now.
And what's been the reaction of people who haven't been there as long? I mean, when we look at your Twitter profile, and I think we actually have a picture behind you right now, we have people from the most recent wave of mobilization, I think. Or maybe that was a different...
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly, you know, there's a lot of draftees being called up now, and a lot of, I mean, it's quite a mixture. You get a lot of very hardened, very experienced older soldiers, and then a lot of very young soldiers who look to me, you know, almost like children, you know. But look, I think that this is a good sign. I mean, I actually saw a friend of mine who I met in Kyiv.
Fighting?
In April.
Who was not a soldier in April?
No, he was there in a T-shirt. It was May or something. I saw him, I didn't recognize him for a minute. He had a big machine gun, lots of, he said, "Hey, David, how are you?" So, "Oh my God, you're here." And he said, "Yeah, I felt that I just had to join up." So I think that this is very positive. Look, in all the time I've been in Ukraine, and as a journalist, one has to, you know, remain impartial and look at things and analyze things. But it is, civil society, the people, the Ukrainian people from Maidan, and it's continuing. And you get people like my friend who have now, crossed over from civil to military society, if you like. So I think this is the great hope for Ukraine. Really.
This is exactly what you're writing, what you were writing at the end of December in your op-ed in New York Times, in your article, Facebook Warriors.
Yeah.
You were saying, I'll quote, that the lesson from the ground is clear: to defeat the separatists, fund Ukraine's people, not just its government.
Yeah.
How this should happen? Who should fund whom, and in what way?
I think there are a lot of Ukrainian NGOs that can be funded. I think channels like Hromadske, I think this is an important tool. I think, all these sorts of organizations can be funded. And I think, you can work with para-state organizations like the volunteer groups to deliver non-lethal supplies. I mean, these are organizations delivering medicine, delivering underwear, delivering yogurt. We broke down on the road.
Literally everything.
Yeah, we broke down on the road just outside Debaltseve and had to unload the car. So I was standing by the side of the road with the shelling, and 2,000 pots of yogurt were just sitting next to me. It was quite a surreal experience.
Well, and I wanted to ask something else about that, because you talked about, the friend that you knew from Maidan and how civil society has changed. I mean, is this a case of civil society gone to war, essentially? Because when we look at it, a lot of these deliveries, it's volunteers, it's organizations that during Maidan were bringing food, that were organizing demonstrations, and they've shifted.
To war zone.
Well, I think to a degree, yes, and I think it's a natural progression. I don't think totally. I mean, you still have a lot of people working. A lot of Maidan went into the political sphere, for example. You still have a lot of people working in NGOs, trying to improve corruption. So I think that's one branch of it, yeah, but this is all a part of the same progression, isn't it? Which is, began with Maidan and now is defending the country. Now, whether that's politically or militarily, the principle's the same.
Isn't it frightening? Don't you think so? That the best people, if I'm not dramatizing here, but if the best people are going there and they might be killed there, so Ukraine might lose the best.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because a friend of mine quoted, I think, someone else, and he said, Russia is sending its worst and Ukraine is sending its best. And this is always a concern. But at the same time, at least you have some of your best people going. At least you have people, a citizenry that is engaged and wants to get involved. And unfortunately, and it's a great shame, getting involved now is this war that has been forced upon you.
David, you have a huge experience also working in the Middle East.
Yes.
And in other war zones, in the conflict zones.
Well, I've been in the Congo, but the most sustained exposure to war zone has been in Ukraine.
Yeah, so my question is, how difficult is it to pitch stories that are difficult from the main discourse, that are not selling, main things like blood, death, or love, or...
I understand, yeah. I mean, look, in waves, because I remember there was a time when the far right in Ukraine was the big story, and everyone wanted stories on the far right.
No matter how big the story was.
Well, exactly, and then it was.
Well, since Euro 2012, I mean, and then came back with Maidan.
Well, exactly, yeah, you're absolutely right. Then it was corruption, corruption in politics. So there are in waves, but I think editors on the whole, I've been very fortunate to work with very good editors who are very sensible. And if you've got a good story and a different angle, bear in mind, editors and newspapers like something original as well. If you've got a good story and Ukraine is full of great human stories, I think you can generally get the story away.
Are you bringing some good stories this time?
I hope so. I'm, writing op-ed, and I'll, write about what I see in the East, and what you see in the East is very important and very interesting, and unfortunately, very emotional. So I would hope so, yes.
Well, maybe taking a look towards the future, we ask our viewers sometimes questions, look for their reactions. So we had another one, we were saying after another failed attempt at a ceasefire, what chances are there for a new Russia-Ukraine truce now? And we had a response which maybe Angelina, you could pull up, that we had here from Plato at Alien Party. The Twitter names are always interesting.
Fantastic.
But the response to that was, the chances of that truce are correlated to the chance of Russia dominating Ukrainian sovereignty, which I guess touches us on this idea. It's something you've seen in op-eds and otherwise, that without a fundamental game-changing compromise, something like Ukraine saying it won't join NATO or ceding some other kind of sovereignty, that solution is impossible. I mean, what's your take on this? And is there any situation where you think, this could lead to a stable peace, or at least a stable ceasefire?
Not in the short term, because I don't think that Vladimir Putin, look, I don't know what Vladimir Putin is thinking, who does, but it seems to me, well, exactly, it seems to me, and all evidence would suggest this, that I don't think This is not a traditional war. You know, in traditional wars, two sides would fight. The women would force a political settlement on the loser, the most egregious example being the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. This is not happening here. It seems to me that what is wanted by Kremlin, by Moscow, is a frozen conflict that goes on, that Putin can raise and then lower as he sees fit. And I suspect that internal Russian politics has a lot to do with it. I wrote this, I said, you know, the problem facing Poroshenko is that he can fight Russian forces, separatist forces, however imperfectly, but he can't fight internal Russian politics. And I think this is a big factor here. So unfortunately, I don't see a compromise anytime soon.
And that's certainly a difficult thing for a lot of people to hear, but it's been a difficult ceasefire as well for a lot of people, and hasn't gone
I mean, if ceasefire can be called, if it can be called a ceasefire,
one that never quite arrived, but one that was referred to a lot. Angelina, do you maybe have another question from one of our viewers to share?
Yeah, I'm just scrolling down. Ukraine should aid civilians in rebel-held areas.
Oh, sorry. Well, let me help out with that. It's not kind of me. I mean, basically, you were mentioning a lot about supplies and how people weren't sufficiently equipped. And one of the questions that came up this week that we asked our viewers would, you know, should Ukraine continue to support civilians on rebel-occupied territories or cut them off? Because this is the issue that people coming from, you know, areas controlled by separatists have, they've instituted what seems to be basically a pass system where you have to apply for documents, you can't move as freely, which created issues for people needing medication, food, access to things. There's also, you know, been some stories about people who are living with HIV or AIDS who need their drugs, or who are, you know, addicted to drugs and had been through different treatments, that it's hard for them to get that. We had one of our viewers responding. So we had, who do we have this time?
Is this Natalia Antonova you're talking about? No?
Yeah, do you want to read that one?
Yeah. So our viewer is saying that Ukraine should aid civilians in rebel-held areas. Lots ill, elderly, poor people there, traitors, rhetoric horrifying, misses points. Well, this is what basically Ian just pointed out. So how this should work with all the people staying there, with all the civilians?
Look, I mean, it's a very complex question. I don't have any easy solution. I certainly take on board the point Natalia makes. I mean, you have perhaps a lot of old people who aren't capable of perhaps getting out of the occupied areas, and in certain senses perhaps it radicalizes the remaining population. But I can also see it from the Ukrainian point of view, where they don't see why they should support people in these breakaway areas. The point I would make, though, is that, you know, when I was in Donetsk, I remember being in there, you know, there the day Slavyansk fell. And the DNR had, you know, tried for a show of strength to put on a rally, a spontaneous rally. And I was at this rally, and actually I interviewed Gubarev shortly afterwards, and there was 500 people there. I counted, I walked, I mean, not exactly, but I walked I have photos of it. So in a city of almost 1 million people, the only people that could show up really were let's say 700 at the most. So it seems to me that, you know, a lot of people in Donetsk, you know, from my experience of being there, most of them were just caught up in a war that they didn't want. You know, they just wanted to get on with their lives. You know, maybe there's sort of greater support for being part of Russia, I don't know, but actual support for the DNR when I was there, just on the street, and bear in mind I was there in April as well, when the building was first taken over. There's 300 people there in a city, again, I repeat, of under 1 million people. So I think this is a very tricky question. I think the point Natalia makes is a valid one, because you get a lot of people who are just, you know, innocents caught up in something that they just don't want to be a part of.
What about the moods now? Because you were there in Donetsk in December.
No, I was with the ATO zone again. Yeah.
Okay.
So I don't know. Ollie Carroll, of course, is the man to speak to about that.
We will try to.
Well, we had him on last week, but I'm sure we'll get him again. But I mean, I think the points you're making are very important, because the big issue is, I mean, geographically, it's what we're already looking at. What will Ukraine look like in the future? But also how you treat people, how they perceive themselves is very key. And it's also, sadly, not an uncommon narrative for refugees from Donetsk and Luhansk to go to other parts of Ukraine and to be blamed for this war, for other things that are difficult. And, you know, going along with this idea is who is a citizen of Ukraine and who should be represented. If we can pull up Or tweet, we have our own Natalia Gomeniuk, who's in New York right
Brilliant.
now, and her responses to that same question is it's not a question at all. The right and only question Ukrainians should ask, how to make it efficient and how to reach everybody. So coming from the same point of view that if people are your citizens, if you're arguing this is your country, then you have to ensure these basic rights.
I wouldn't dare argue with Natalia anyway, even if I disagreed.
None of us would recommend it. It's happened on occasion, but I also try and avoid it.
Okay, David, thank you so much for coming here.
No, it's great. Thank
Good
you for
luck with your
inviting me.
stories, and I think this is not the last time we're speaking on air. And we'll be going further, and we'll be switching to our next block. And Ian, maybe you will
Yeah, I'll take that.
take the ATR story.
So we had some key important events this week in Crimea, specifically the ATR television channel, which is the only channel on the Crimean Peninsula to broadcast in Tatar. They were raided by the Russian security forces. Now, not entirely clear who they were at first, because they were just wearing military clothes without identifications. They're trying to seize the organization's hard drive, and this has contributed to a general worsening situation for human rights, but also for media freedom. So we want to show a video now. ATR was broadcasting live when part of this raid was going on, and we have one of those videos.
Основанием у них послужило постановление о производстве обыска от сегодняшнего числа по уголовному делу по факту смерти 2 лиц на митинге, который был проведен 26 февраля 2014 года. Якобы у нас есть материал, который мы не предоставляли в Следственный комитет. Хотя на протяжении года нам не раз поступали обращения, собственно, с любых органов, где идет запрос, мы всегда предоставляем такую информацию. Вот сейчас вы видите на территории телеканала АТР порядка 40 человек, которые... Сейчас я даю интервью чуть попозже.
Давайте вас там ваш директор же
Я даю интервью. Это мое право.
Нет, вопросов нет.
Это мое право дать.
Директор попросил вас подойти.
Какой директор? Я сама генеральный директор. Я генеральный директор. Отойдите, пожалуйста, я даю, конечно.
Смотрите, какая ситуация. Здесь возникла такая немножко...
Да, вообще же просто следственное действие.
После их окончания вы можете дать любое интервью, вопросы.
So we're switching to the block where we will talk on the human rights situation in Crimea. We have very interesting guests and people on Skype as well. Let me just first introduce you Arsen Zhumadilov. Arsen, thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you.
Arsen is the coordinator at the Crimean Institute for Strategic Studies, and as far as I know, you also work as a representative of Mustafa Dzhemilov, right? The leader of
Absolutely, yeah.
Crimean Tatars. And do we have Skype? So, and on Skype, we have Dmitry Makarov from Voronezh, Russia. Dmitry is a deputy head of the Crimean Field Mission. It's one of the few organizations that work in Crimea, monitoring the human rights situation, working basically in the field and sharing this information with the majority of the international organizations. So, Dmitry, good evening. Do you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Good evening.
Thank you for joining us tonight. Dmitry, we would like to ask you about the general human rights situation in Crimea right now. We know that there was this case with the ATR channel, but in general, what is in general happening? What is the general situation with the human rights situation in Crimea?
Well, I mean, currently there is a number of recent developments that highlight the situation which Crimean inhabitants find themselves. So it's not only the incident around the ATR, the only Crimean Tatar television, it's also a number of incidents connected with arrests and searches in the homes of Crimean Tatars. One of the remaining leaders of Mejlis was arrested a few days ago on charges related to those charges have been raised around the ATR searches. And those charges relate to the February 26th incident, which happened, in fact, before Russia has taken Crimea. So this is one of the most worrisome cases recently. But besides that, the common people find themselves still in a gray zone. They don't really understand whether the Russian laws have started to apply full force or there is still some uncertainty about it.
Well, I think that's a key point that you bring up. I mean, there seems to be a lot of legal uncertainty, certainly when this law is applied, but there are also these so-called, self-defense units, which aren't the regular police, which have received some forms of amnesty. And, in a Human Rights Watch report covering Crimea, they were implicated in a lot of abuses, if not disappearances, of Crimean Tatars. I mean, is the rule of law sort of out the window in Crimea at this point?
Well, I mean, the disappearances do not only concern Crimean Tatars, they concern also the Ukrainian minority, or even better to say activist minority.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, those cases have been very widespread during the spring. Then there was an active phase of this type of takeover, but they continue on. And the fact that people who are guilty, who are responsible for those disappearances have not been found, that there are multiple links to the so-called Samoborona or self-defense forces that have not been investigated. It also adds to the atmosphere of, let's say, impunity, which also kind of makes people insecure.
Dmitry, but
and it's not only about Crimean Tatars.
Are these cases reported, and do you have any numbers of how many Tatars or how many other residents of Crimea vanished or were kidnapped?
I mean, Human Rights Watch has done an investigation, has pretty accurate numbers, and they partly based it also on the information that we had. Since then, there have been a number of other disappearances, and we'd say now about 9 cases. We know for sure that people have disappeared, and about 5 of them have, let's say, traits of enforced disappearances. So there's evidence that suggests that those people have been kidnapped and have been held by force.
Mm-hmm.
What happens to the others, we do not know, but the investigation does not also give answers.
If we get back to the self-defense again, as far as I know, they were literally incorporated into the state system. They are funded from the budget, and they have a pretty high immunity right now. What are their rights? I mean, what they can do just out there in the street? What is their role in this whole security system in Crimea right now?
Well, it's actually quite complicated to explain because, in fact, it's basically a militia type of force. So it's basically voluntary force by citizens, which supposedly do not have any additional rights and supposed to assist police in performing police duties. But in reality, we see that it is those people who have been quite active in pressing dissent back in the spring that have been implicated in a number of cases of disappearances. At least the witnesses testify that they have seen people that looked like self-defense forces. And those are the people who are now quite active in, let's say, takeover of property. That's an issue that goes unnoticed, although, I mean, after New York Times has done a publication that there's been a lot of publicity around takeover of property, and self-defense is active in that. So legally, technically, we don't have any rights to use force and only are there to assist the police. But in reality, we see that it's a legal, it's a quasi-legal paramilitary unit, which is loyal to the current head of Crimea and is active to perform what he demands of them.
Mm-hmm. So what's the most dangerous thing to do is now in Crimea, talking in terms of human rights? What's the most? Is there such a thing as having a political position that may be dangerous?
Well, I would not exaggerate things on one hand, because still it's not the atmosphere of totalitarian state, hopefully. But on the other hand, of course, we see also people being kidnapped. We see people being arrested, and those cases have intensified. People do not know what to expect from the state, although this relates to people who have been either actively pro-Ukrainian or who are Crimean Tatars who have voiced their opposition to the annexation. Those people who have been for the annexation I mean, they see difficulties in other things. They see difficulties
Like what?
that there are a number of limitations on freedom of assembly, for instance. And some of those people have been quite active. I mean, during the so-called Russian Spring, those people used to go out on the street and protest for Russia to take over. Now they can no longer do that. They see that some of the property that they have owned or that they know about have been taken over by people loyal to the current government. They see that many of the people they have been, let's say, opposed to before and tied them to the previous administration are still in power. So there's a sort of level of disillusionment. Whether that disillusionment will transform into any type of political action or any type of criticism, that is yet to be seen. But there are many realities, I'd say, to Crimea, and there are two distinct ones. One is the reality of people who wanted the annexation to take place, and the second is the reality of people who did not want it to take place. And the majority of the second ones have already left.
I see. Thank you, Dmitry, so much. Thank you, Dmitry, so much. We now will switch to our guest, Arsen Zhumadil. Arsen, I will start with a question regarding the situation of Crimean Tatars living in Crimea right now. How did life for Crimean Tatars change since the annexation?
Do you mind if, before I take your question, I'll say just a couple of words on the things that we have just heard. First of all, we have to be very clear that not most people did go out on streets to protest for Russia in spring 2014. This is just not true, all right? There were, I was there on the ground. I saw these people. There were just a few dozens. Then closer to the referendum, or the so-called referendum, we saw a few hundreds of them protesting for Russia in the central square. So just a few hundreds, we can't call these people most of the Crimeans, all right? This is the first thing to say. The second one is that we cannot say that most of those who were for Ukraine, they have already left the peninsula. This is also not true. Why? Because I know that the Crimean Tatars predominantly, they stay in Crimea. Why? Because for us, it's just not an option to leave the place. This is our motherland. This is the only place, the only land on earth that we attribute to ourselves. Therefore, we are not leaving. We are staying there. There are just a couple of thousand, up to 10,000 Crimean Tatars who left Crimea, and they, me including, make up less than 3% of the Crimean Tatar population in Crimea.
So for those who stayed and for those who did not support the annexation, how is life for them there? Can they keep their Ukrainian passports? Can they keep their pro-Ukrainian positions and go public with this position? How life changed for them?
The short answer is they can't. They cannot. And we've seen many evidence that if a person stands up and says what he thinks about the occupation, he is either expelled, or he is kidnapped, or he is threatened by a house raid. So there is no freedom of speech there in Crimea. This is the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that we in Kyiv, meaning Ukraine, are doing very little to actually address these people, because we expect them to do heroic acts. We expect them to, go out to the streets, say something, protest. But if
when you say we, you mean whom?
I mean with the Crimeans. I mean with the Crimeans, including the Crimean Tatars who stay for Ukraine in Crimea. I was there just a couple of months ago. It was early November. The atmosphere there is that you can't even breathe normally, Pretty much all the friends who commute to the mainland Ukraine, as we call it, they say when we enter Ukraine, it feels like we are breathing fresh air, that we now can breathe. And in Crimea, you can't breathe. So it is so much, stifled, or how you put it, that you can't really go and say things. You have a very powerful self-censorship there.
But if we're not talking about things like metaphorically stiff air or something like that. Could you be more specific? Because there was some incidents, as far as I know, like last week, people were held in detention or arrested or deported. For what reason, do you think?
Yeah. Well, since the occupation, we have 4 people that were expelled from Crimea and banned from entry to Crimea. These include the 2 leaders of the Crimean Tatar people, Mr. Mustafa Dzhemilov and Mr. Rifat Chubarov. The last one was expelled, yes, last week, as you mentioned. He was expelled from Crimea for his civic activism. He and 2 colleagues of his, they have founded...
Also members of Majlis, right?
Yes, they have founded a civic society organization that is called a Committee for Human Rights Protection of the Crimean Tatars and other citizens of Crimea. And they have just started. They haven't done, you know, that much to be punished or to be prosecuted, but still the authorities, they are very attentive. They are keeping an eye on such activism. So they were very quick to react, and they expelled one of them, and they threatened the 2 others. So these are the fresh cases.
But wait, let me interrupt here. Why do you think this happened now, when we have... Is there, in your opinion, is there any link between the escalation in the east and those things happening in Crimea, or is just a coincidence and it doesn't have anything?
It's a very good question. I don't think it's a coincidence. As Mustafa Dzhemilov recently said in his interview, Russia now is agonizing. It has just very little time left, and so it's doing very nasty things, because it realizes that not that much time is left for it to live through.
What does that mean? I mean, that Russia will be stopped, or that it's expected to fall apart? Because that...
We are talking about the regime, all right?
Yeah.
So the regime has has very little time left, and the sanctions that that are now imposed against Russia by the US and the EU, and the oil prices and the currency
Russian
exchange.
economy has been hit hard, but I mean, a lot of people would argue that hasn't manifested politically yet. That there haven't been those changes in Russia.
Well, yes, but you know, social processes are not that straightforward, all right? So sometimes you need a momentum, and the problem in Russia is that you don't really have an organized political force that would, you know, create the momentum so that all the others would join, would jump in, and we have to, you know, we have to admit that Mr. Putin has done a great job in, you know, cleansing...
well, in centralizing power and handling it that way. But to change the conversation slightly, I mean, when we were talking about all these, you know, abuses of the human rights of Crimean Tatars and citizenship and all of that, what is the perception within the Crimean Tatar community, especially in Crimea, of how the international community is reacting? Now, Ukraine obviously speaks about this topic a lot, so does Turkey when there are different meetings, the OSCE and so on. I mean, amongst Crimean Tatars, is there a sense that this is addressed enough? Is there a desire for it to be discussed more? How have they reacted, and what, you know, call for action is there?
Well, honestly, I think that it is pretty much the other way around. The feeling is that the international community is doing pretty much okay, if I can put it this way. That is, you know, it is putting pressure on Russia to stop the aggression against Ukraine, including the occupation of Crimea. But the feeling is that Ukraine is not doing its job in its turn. And, you know, now, for example, Ukraine has blocked the communication, the passenger communication with Crimea. So for those loyal citizens of Ukraine who would commute easily with the mainland part of our country, now it is a great difficulty just to, you know, to come and see their friends or relatives, or to do business as they would the whole year in 2014. So there are very many you know, strange decisions that we are very uneasy about, and now we are trying to build, you know, robust dialogues with all the centers of power in Kyiv. Unfortunately, we have not been that much effective, but I think that we are on the right way, on the right track. I mean, when I say we, I mean the Majlis leadership, which is now in Kyiv, as you know, including Mr. Mustafa Jamilov, Mr. Rifat Chubarov.
But what do you think, just ending our conversation, what do you think should be done by Ukrainian government? Is that,
First of all,
do you think there's a strategy of winning Crimea back, or how should this work, in your opinion?
That is absolutely to the point. We should plot something like a roadmap for Crimea to be reintegrated into Ukraine, and we have to clearly communicate it to the people who live in Crimea, saying that, for example, we are initiating something like United Nations Transitional Authority for Crimea that will be working there for 1 or 2 years, as it was, for example, in Croatia, when it was occupied, or pretty much, vast territories of Croatia were occupied by Serbia. This is what they did. They invited UN to broker the deal. They did their job very successfully, and in 2 years' time, these territories were reintegrated to Croatia peacefully. This is something that we would see as a very good scenario for Crimea. That is, we should say to the Crimeans, look, now the only thing for the regime in Russia to wait for is for somebody to say that the king is naked. And after it is done, it will all crumble. But you don't be afraid, because now they are fed with stereotypes that, oh, Ukraine will punish you all. Because, as we sometimes say, most of people voted for Russia at the referendum. This is just not true. We have to be very clear. They did not. Yeah, they are not guilty, they are innocent, therefore they will not be punished. We will punish only those who are now doing their crimes against the humanity. We know their names, surnames very well. All their cases are at the General Prosecutor's Office.
So the Crimean Tatars are working on that plan? This is what you're trying to say. Are they?
The Crimean Tatars including, yes, of course. This is the very essence of what we are doing in Kyiv. Otherwise, we would stay in Crimea because this is our motherland.
Okay, and is this, I mean, when you're talking about the people who are involved, this is the leadership, but also these so-called self-defense forces, or who are the people that are focused on? Yes,
absolutely. Self-defense, these are, notorious people, and we've been explained very well about who they are. Of course, but the problem with them is that there are just too many of them. Once Aksionov said that there were up to 100,000 of members of these self-defense units. This is just way too much. We have to be very precise about whom we punish. We cannot impose collective, responsibility for the things done. We have to be very clear about who did what. This is not a very easy thing to do, but this is a necessary thing to do.
Well, maybe addressing that point, we had a question we asked, one of our viewers had a tweet, which maybe Angelina could pull up, and she was asking you, or I believe it's a she, it said Manu is the name, but it said, please ask our guests about the most recent arrest of Crimean Tatar, Mr. Gimici? Sorry, did I pronounce it
yes,
correctly?
Gimici, yes.
Thank you. Could you have any more details about that arrest?
Yes, this is a case when a representative of a vulnerable group is under threat in Russian Crimea. When I say vulnerable group, I mean a visibly religious person. So he is a Muslim, and he has a beard, so you can easily say that he is a practicing Muslim. And you know that in Russia, a good Muslim is a loyal Muslim. All others are not good.
Loyal to whom?
Loyal to Mr. Putin.
I see.
So if you are not, then you are not a good Muslim. It does not matter what you profess, or like what you stay for or stand for. It's just you have to be very, very outspoken, very clear about your loyalty. If you are not, then probably you will have problems. This is just another case of what we see in Crimea.
I see.
So the last question from our viewer is about the numbers. We were just about to give us some maybe more specific numbers. Maybe you have some numbers of how many people, or maybe specifically how many Crimean Tatars have left Crimea since the annexation.
Well, the problem with our registration system in Ukraine is that it does not register people living in Crimea by their ethnic origin. So when we ask them, how come, why don't you do this? They say we do not discriminate by, people's ethnic origin, which does not make much sense. We have to be very clear about knowing very well about what social groups are living in Crimea. This is key for the reintegration of. All right. So we are working on it to make the registration system change a little bit so that it does track the Crimean Tatars, including. So now the figures that we have are not official. According to our estimates, the number is somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 Crimean Tatars, but the problem is sometimes, people would go back to Crimea, sometimes they would come here, stay here for a while, and then go back, or the other way around. So the process is dynamic.
And what's the total size of the Crimean Tatar population?
It is 300,000 out of around 2 million people in Crimea. So we make up to 15% of the population. And this is actually one of the points that I would like to make, is that for us, the annexation is not the first time in history that we are living through such an experience. This is the third one. This is the third one. The first one was in 1783, when we, the Crimean Tatars, we constituted pretty much 95% of the population in Crimea. The second one was in 1918, when we proclaimed our state in Crimea. Then we were invaded by the Bolsheviks from Russia, and then we were around 50%, so the number of the Crimean Tatars was brought down in 1.5 century to around 50% of the population, but still we were the major ethnic group in Crimea. Now in 2014 we are through the third time, and it's only 13 to 15% of us in Crimea. So for us, it is key not to repeat the mistakes of the past. One of them was massive, emigration from Crimea to other lands. So now we will be very firm in our position that we will not be leaving Crimea. So
we thank you for that historical context. It's something we'll
obviously hard times for the Crimean Tatars. Thank you so much for coming to our show tonight.
Now we want to take a look, looking back at the international stage. As you know, on Hromadske, we like to look at what's going on in other countries as well. This week we had the beginning of the Litvinenko inquiry in London, in the United Kingdom. Alexander Litvinenko was a former agent, I believe, for the KGB, who died in London in 2006 after being poisoned with polonium. Now we're joined by Luke Harding, who works for The Guardian, who's been there in the courtroom this week. Luke, are you there? Oh, hopefully we'll get to him soon.
Nice to be with you.
Oh, excellent. Nice to have you here. First we just wanted to ask you, what was the atmosphere in the courtroom this week? I mean, on the one hand, obviously these are events that took place in 2006, and it's taken a while to get to this inquiry point. But on the other hand, the issue of Russia looking at the FSB and the security services is very, very relevant.
Well, it's been a long time coming, this public inquiry. As you know, Alexander Litvinenko was murdered in November 2015, discussing all of these events. And a big struggle for Marina Litvinenko, Alexander Litvinenko's widow, because she's been trying to get justice. The British government has not been very helpful. And really, I think the political dynamic changed last year with the annexation of Crimea, the war in East Ukraine, and so on, and obviously relations got worse. And now there's a public inquiry, which began last week and will go on for 10 weeks. And I think, I've talked to Marina, I've talked to her son Anatoly, and I think what they hope from this inquiry is some kind of closure. The truth of what happened to Alexander Litvinenko all those years ago, but I think an opportunity for them to move on as well.
And when it comes to inquiry, I mean, is it really just the current political situation that sees the West pitted against Russia that's made it possible? There seemed to be a lot of talk that, previously the government wasn't so eager to have such a public and open inquiry. it would worsen relations between the UK and Russia? Is there just a sense that at this point, it couldn't get any worse, so now is the time? Or is it just persistent lobbying on behalf of his family? What's your sense there?
Well, I think it's two things. I think undoubtedly the political climate has worsened. I mean, David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, when he came in 2010, he tried to do what Barack Obama and the States had also tried to do, which is to have a kind of reset with the Kremlin, with Vladimir Putin, to have a kind of pragmatic, you might say, mercantilist relationship which was focused on trade and less on human rights and less on Russia's own kind of depressing domestic situation. And he pursued that policy for a couple of years. I think really that's the but at the same time, in addition to that, Marina Litvinenko has she's gone to court. Initially, the government didn't want an inquiry. She went to the High Court, she appealed, she won, and finally the government gave in. But sitting there watching it's been an amazing exercise. We've learned some extraordinary new things this week. Two men have been charged with Litvinenko's murder, Andrey and Dmitry Koftin. But there have been some amazing revelations. We discovered this week that they tried to get Litvinenko not once but twice.
Yeah, I mean, that was very interesting to hear. And I wanted to ask, because you have the image of the Russian security services, which have obviously been very involved in Crimea, also in eastern Ukraine, and there's the image that's presented often, and maybe that's also through James Bond films or other fiction, but as these crack teams that are super well organized, and as you mentioned, the inquiry has seen that they tried to poison them twice. You talked about, them putting the polonium first in a teapot, right, that then spilled all over everything. It seems to be presenting a very different image.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I take away from this inquiry, having covered it, is that neither Lugovoy nor Koftin knew what they were carrying. They knew they had a very expensive poison, but they didn't know that it was radioactive. They didn't know that they themselves were at risk. They knew they'd been sent to kill Litvinenko, but they didn't know with what. And we heard that they tried on October 25th, 2006, and it looks like, we haven't had the detail yet, it looks like they spilled this stuff all over the table. It didn't work. Of course, second time around, in this infamous meeting in the Millennium Hotel in London on the 1st of November, they succeeded. They put it in a teapot. But we've got the most astonishing story about Dmitry Koftin, who I've met in Moscow. I've met both of them. And let's just say he's not the brightest guy in town. Anyway, he came to London via Germany. He took the polonium with him, the inquiry heard. And then he went to see an old friend of his who was a waiter in a restaurant he'd worked in Hamburg. And he asked his friend if he knew any cooks in London who might administer this poison and put it in Litvinenko's food or drink. And amazingly, his friend did know a cook in London. And on the morning of the poisoning, Koftin is busy phoning this cook. I mean, this does not...
It just seems surreal. I mean, it doesn't seem believable. It's
surreal, but they were not very good assassins. But of course, what they did was a kind of a deadly poison. And we heard that once Litvinenko drank from this cup, that the dose was so huge, there was absolutely no way he could have survived. And of course, the only reason he survived so long, he lasted 23 days, was because he was super fit. And a normal person would have died more quickly, and the cause of the death would never have been discovered.
Luke, sorry for interrupting, but I know it's just a speculation, but what if the coroner rules that Kremlin was ordered or somehow was in this murdering of Litvinenko? What happens between UK and Russia? Can it be even more worse than right now? What may happen?
Yeah, Angelina, that's a great question. Just look at what happened last week. So on Tuesday, Ben Emerson, who's a kind of eminent British lawyer acting for Marina and Anatoly Litvinenko, stands up. He tells the inquiry that Vladimir Putin is a common criminal dressed up as a head of state, a common criminal. That's his quote. He says that Russia is a mafia state, which actually is the title of my book, which I know Ben Emerson has read. He kind of borrowed from my book quite heavily. And he basically says that Russia now is a regime where organized crime, the state, and the FSB have merged into a kind of single kind of criminal enterprise, if you like. This is not pleasant at the Kremlin, and I know that officials are normally pretty kind of insouciant about these sort of things. They say it's all Western propaganda. But anyway, the day after this speech, on Wednesday, two Tupolev bear bombers from Moscow buzz the English Channel, fly very close to the south coast of England. They disrupt civil aviation. Their transponders are turned off. The RAF, British Air Force, has to scramble 2 Typhoon jets to shadow them. And suddenly, very Cold War again. And I think it was clear that was a symbol of displeasure. It was a message from the Kremlin that we are still a great power, a mighty power, and we are not to be messed with.
But it's also a sign that they care about, I mean, this court case, if you look at it that way, that on the one hand, you know, they're saying this is Western propaganda, it's a show trial put together when relations are bad, but on the other hand, you know, you seem to have some indications that people are very unhappy there. I mean, my question, though, is how much of it can really be connected to Putin, and what possible result is there for this inquiry? Because there also are parts behind closed doors that people won't have access to, you know, things considered to be damaging, I believe, for the Russian state as well. What are the possible results of all of this?
Well, I mean, there'll be no practical results. It's not a trial as such. The two suspects who've been charged with murder, Kaufman and Lugovoy, are sitting happily in Moscow, and Lugovoy is now a member of the Duma for the ultra-nationalist LPDR party, Zhirinovsky's party. So they won't be extradited. Putin made it already clear in 2007 he had no intention of letting them stand trial. So it took justice process. No, nothing. But what the inquiry chairman, Robert Owen, will do is he will come up with he will basically say who he thinks is blamed for Litvinenko's murder. All the implications are that he's blamed the state. So it's just an exercise ultimately, I think, in truth-telling. But the important thing is that, as you know all too well, sitting in Kyiv, sitting in Ukraine, we are in the midst of this kind of huge, titanic information battle in which Kremlin propaganda, I mean, I've been covering Russia for quite a while now, is at levels we've never seen before, where there's a mixture of disinformation, of sheer lying, of conspiracy theory, and you have the Kremlin spending more than $300 million on Russia today. You see, I don't know what your budget is, but I suspect for Hromadske TV it's not $300 million. And so I think it's just quite nice to have the truth for once. I mean, it's been interesting just to see the forensic evidence that the British police have collected. They've done a pretty good job. There's an awful lot of it. They've mapped this Polonian trail. They've found it all over the place. And in this world of kind of crazy relativism and of lying and of invention, it's quite nice to be back in a Cartesian world, in an empirical world, where actually you can say, this is what happened. These are the people who are guilty.
Well, it takes some of the relativism away. I mean, it says these are the questions and what actual evidence is there, as opposed to spin and media. Well, we'll certainly look forward to seeing your future reports in The Guardian and getting more information from that. Thank you so much for joining us
Thank
today.
you, Luke. We'll be following the inquiry as well. And now we'll be switching, we'll be moving to, I guess, one of the most awaited parts of our program. I personally was looking forward for it so much. We will talk to our guest, a well-known abroad Ukrainian writer, Andrey Kurkov. Andrey, sorry for keep you waiting so much. I'll just, maybe you're one of the few Ukrainian writers who needs introduction for the international community. Andrey's books were translated into more than 36 languages, and one of his latest books is just write about the latest events in Ukraine diaries, dispatches from Kyiv.
And we're so happy to have you, because you're someone who not only knows Ukraine, but part of our mission we try and look at is not just to cover Ukraine, but Ukraine in a wider Eastern European context. Certainly your background as, someone who's ethnically Ukrainian, but grew up in Russia.
Well, I'm ethnically actually Russian.
Oh, you're ethnically Russian.
Born in Russia, grew up in Kyiv.
Oh, I see there. I'm sorry.
And writing in Russian.
Writing in Russian.
See, I've already gotten confused. That's why we need you on the show to clear all that up.
See, has this ever been an issue, explaining someone abroad your identity? Has this ever been an issue?
Well, it never stopped being an issue. I mean, but I think I have less questions now from the foreign audiences about it than 5 or 10 years ago.
Really?
Because 10 years ago, actually, the first question would be, where is Ukraine?
And now?
Now it's mostly actually the questions about future of Russian-Ukrainian relations, about Crimea, about daily life during the war.
But what do you think Ukrainian identity means to you? What could be a part of this identity? I mean, we have a well-known Ukrainian writer writing in Russian. Maybe your readers in Europe do not even care that you actually write in Russian. They read your text
well, they know
in their
because
native
on the
languages.
books it says that translated from Russian. Yes.
So what is being Ukrainian to you? What is being a citizen of Ukraine to you right now?
It's my, I would say, personal judgment, because I mean, whenever I start talking about this with my Ukrainian colleagues, we never stop. I mean, we just start drinking then afterwards instead of finding a solution. But generally, I've been loyal to the state, paying taxes, which actually is not very common in this country. But I have been doing it for many, many years. And I remember the first time I came to declare my income, the lady in the tax office said, why do you leave this money abroad? I mean, you are earning money abroad. You declared more than President Kuchma. It's not politically correct. Well, I said, I'm sorry, because, I mean, if I leave the money abroad, then I am not really a citizen of this country, and then I should be worried always that one day I will be discovered.
So you have to put your money where your mouth is to make it work.
Yes.
Why is it important for you to keep your money here and to be a citizen of Ukraine?
Paying taxes is important. I can keep money where I want.
Whatever the money goes.
But the state's, the angels share, the state's share should
stay here, at least for a while.
Because my kids go to Ukrainian schools, because I use, sometimes night lighting of the city. I want to live comfortably in a comfortable state where everybody is happy, and to keep everybody happy costs a lot of money, especially if people who are supposed to keep others happy are corrupt.
Well, happiness is certainly hard now, but I wanted to kind of focus your attention to something else. You have this book which has gotten a lot of publicity in the West, the Ukraine Diaries, Dispatches from Kyiv, and you kind of describe the conversations going on in Ukraine during Maidan and all of that. And do you have a sense that Ukrainian society has changed and is changing? And your book was looking at Maidan. We've already moved on to the war. What are some of the changes going on now? And is there a different idea of what it means to be Ukrainian now than there was 6, 7, 8 months ago?
Well, so many questions in one.
Take the one you like.
Yes,
how has society changed?
The society changed a lot, but I want to say that, I lived through 2004, through Orange Revolution, and then there was some kind of feeling that the Ukraine will never be the same again, and suddenly, it took only 2 years of passivity of the new democratic government, and everything went back to normal and even became worse. Now it won't be the same again, because the society is very radicalized, because there is a split, although it's not a split between two parts of the country, it's a split now between a huge part of the country and small regions which are under control of separatists or Russian army or Russian minders, etc. But I would say the level of sincere patriotism went up over the clouds. But also, the perception of this patriotism became very militant. So, now if you say you are a patriot, you should be ready to take Kalashnikov and go as a volunteer to Donbass.
Well, it's hard because I know from people who are on Maidan, when I think it came to May, the people who said, the people who stayed on Maidan who are still there, I can't understand them, because the people who are patriotic when revolved went to the front. And that seems to be, it came up a little earlier, but there is the sense of Maidan having gone to the front now as being a mixture of war and the cutting edge of civil society somehow.
I think when we are talking about Maidan, we should understand that Maidan was not a well-organized army of people who think the same things. Because I went there sometimes 3 times a day. I talked to different people from different tents. And actually, on each tent there would be usually a name of the village or district or city, because these tents were like headquarters, regional headquarters for people who are coming to join Maidan, and they would get help there. They would be advised where to stay overnight, maybe in theater center Kurbas on Vladimirskaya, where lots of people from Maidan also
or the city council
slept, or city council, etc. And I mean, when I was talking to I felt that everybody hated corruption, everybody hated Yanukovych, everybody wanted Ukraine to be wonderful and democratic, but everyone had also his or her own idea what should be done with Ukraine, and sometimes the ideas were bizarre. And the other thing is that there were a lot of people who came to Maidan from afar, from different regions of Ukraine, because they were personally upset or deceived or mistreated by the local governments, by the head of the city, village council, by somebody else, by local police. So they also brought their bitterness and their desire to take revenge. So, I mean, for them, Yanukovych was also a symbol of this injustice. Yes. Yeah. But, I mean, the funny thing was that sometimes, actually, I mean, I remember one case, there was a boy from Ternopil region who I talked to him, and I mean, when I was there, I was speaking not Russian, I speak Ukrainian as well as Russian and some other languages. So, and he said that, well, I will stay here until the end, until Russian language is banned in Ukraine. And I was quite surprised.
That's probably not what you expected.
Yes, and I said, why? I said, well, because Russian language is actually Putin's language, and when it is banned, I mean, everybody will speak Ukrainian, and the country will be happy. And one thing, I mean, I noticed, I mean, he was the only person I met with this strange idea. But then somebody told me from my foreign friends that they know that there are nationalists who are anti-Russian, and especially anti-Russian language on Maidan. And I think there was some kind of path from different hotels to his tent to have this
guided tours directly there, given
to have
by
this statement.
Andrey, but still, that was a pretty comfortable atmosphere to write. Yes, you did end your book and you published your book. What about now?
I wouldn't say it was comfortable. I mean, because I mean, I stopped writing my novel in November. Actually, once because I mean, I had been writing my novel, which I didn't finish until today, because I don't write it now. And I was writing a collection of essays for Austrian publisher about Ukraine and I would say difference between Ukraine and Russia, between mentalities, culture.
I'll rephrase. It was probably, just correct me if I'm wrong, it was a comfortable atmosphere to reflect upon identity, upon everything that is happening in Ukraine. What about now? Is this militarization, as you said, of mind somehow
I feel uneasy about the word comfortable atmosphere. Well, I wouldn't say it was comfortable, especially, I mean, if, I mean, I live 400 meters from Maidan. When there were cars burned down on our street. I mean, my flat was blocked by so-called titushki, and the people from security forces of Maidan came with me to sort out the situation, because my daughter was alone in the flat and was afraid to open the door, and they were demanding that she opens the door. And so, I mean, there was no comfort about this.
Okay, maybe it was the right time. The time was calling to reflect. And
well, everybody, I mean, I think every writer probably stopped writing fiction or poetry at that time, and were writing blogs or writing on Facebook, on columns, and trying to understand, if they understood, trying to explain. So, I mean, I was involved in the same process. I was looking for, not for the reasons, because I knew why everything was happening, but I wanted to try to understand where it will go next and what is possible. And I probably, first time actually in my life, I couldn't predict correctly anything at all.
You couldn't predict Crimea, Donbass, and everything?
No. Although, I mean, I predicted everything about Crimea in my book, which was published in 2004, The President's Last Love, and the book is banned in Russia. But I mean, my books are not published in Russia from 2008 anyway. But this book also to be sold in Russia. But there, actually, Putin is one of the characters, and he promises Ukrainian counterpart to take away Crimea and to cut off gas supplies, which was 1 year before gas crisis and 10 years before.
Seems like a prediction.
So we have life imitating art in this case.
Well, yes, but I mean, it doesn't mean that people shouldn't try to write about the future, even if they think that they...
What about now? What are your thoughts about Ukrainian future and the future of those people you were writing about in your book, and probably part of them now moving to the front lines? What are their future? What do you think?
Well, the future is quite difficult because, I mean, even once the conflict is over, I will not try to describe how long it will take to reintegrate psychologically Donbass. I will probably will take even longer to sort out situation in the Crimea. But we are talking also about destinies of probably tens of thousands of volunteers who are coming back to their villages and towns, being soldiers, losing their friends, with a very, I would say, almost pathological sense of justice. And, and I mean, some of them, as you know, I mean, who are trying now to come back, they're trying also to bring arms with them. Kalashnikovs,
we're looking at a changed society and things that will
so
keep
I mean,
going.
this will be not only pressure on local governments, it will be just the society which is in different places is ready to blow up, to explode, because if there are no changes, if there are no real reforms, if the people who were corrupt before Maidan are still in power, and unfortunately in many cases it is still the same situation.
Well, I think that's the note we'll have
and so, I mean, we are looking in the future, I would say, with anxiety and thinking about more of a social conflict than international or civil conflict.
Well, and I think that's, all right, I said it before, but so you're giving us some interesting food for thought about the way it'll continue and the ramifications in the future.
Thank you so much for coming tonight.
Thank
We're
you.
looking forward for your new novels and looking into the changing society, Ukrainian changing society, probably changing identity, I don't know, or
Well,
recovering identity.
if all these people join police or replace police, maybe it will be a solution.
We'll see, we'll see. Thank you so much, Andrey.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us. Join us next week for our weekly Sunday show. Goodbye.